In the quiet suburb of Willow Lane, just outside Sacramento, the golden hues of the California sunset spilled over neatly trimmed lawns and rows of ranch-style homes. The neighborhood was a picture of suburban tranquility, kids riding bikes until dusk, neighbors chatting over fences, and the faint hum of sprinklers keeping the grass green. At the end of the cul-de-sac stood the Harper family's modest two-story house, its faded blue siding blending into the dusk. Inside, Edward Harper sat on the edge of his chair, staring out the living room window as the last of the light faded. Something had been off for the past 2 weeks, and it wasn't just the long spring evenings or the crickets that filled the air. It was Ranger, their 5-year-old German shepherd, who had turned their peaceful nights into a mystery that gnawed at Edward's nerves. Ranger was no ordinary dog. He had been adopted from a local shelter as a generous puppy and had grown into a gentle giant with a shiny black and tan coat and deep brown eyes. The neighborhood children adored him, gathering around to pet him on evening walks, and he would wag his tail for attention. When Edward and his wife Eleanor brought home their newborn son, Henry, 3 months ago, Ranger had become a sworn protector of the child. During naps, he lay by the crib, his head resting on his paws, moving only to nudge Henry's blanket back into place with his nose. But 2 weeks ago, that calm devotion had changed to something else, something disturbing. Every night, as the clock struck 8 p.m., Ranger would sit by Henry's crib in the upstairs nursery. His ears would perk up, his body tense, and a low, steady growl would escape his throat. It wasn't the playful bark he made when the mailman came, or the sharp yelp he gave when he saw a squirrel. It was different, deep, deliberate, almost a warning. Edward had noticed it first when he stood in the nursery doorway one evening, and Ranger's gaze had settled on the corner of the room. "What's wrong with him?" he muttered to Eleanor, who stood beside him, holding Henry in her arms. "I don't know," she said, her voice strained with worry. "He's never done this before. Do you think he's sick?" Eleanor had always been practical, an elementary school teacher who saw solutions where Edward saw puzzles. She suggested a visit to the vet, and Edward agreed, hoping for an easy answer. But the vet gave Ranger a clean bill of health, perfect for a dog his age. "Dogs can pick up things we can't," the vet said with a shrug. "Sounds, smells, even changes in the air. Maybe something in the house scared him." That comment stuck with Edward. He spent the next few nights watching Ranger, trying to figure out what had set him off. The nursery was a small, cozy room with pale yellow walls, a rocking chair, and a mobile phone with tiny stars dangling above the crib. The windows were tightly closed, the screens intact, no sign of creatures sneaking in. But Ranger never focused on that one corner, even when Henry was sound asleep, the only sound in the room being his soft breathing. Edward checked everything he could think of. No loose floorboards, no drafts, nothing out of place. But the Ranger's growling continued, a nightly ritual that made Edward restless and Eleanor tense. "Maybe it's the house," Eleanor said one evening over dinner as she spread mashed potatoes on a plate. "Remember last fall when he kept scratching at the kitchen wall? Turns out there was a leak behind the drywall." She was right. The Ranger had a knack for sniffing out trouble, literally. The leak was a slow trickle that they would never have noticed without his insistence. "What if he's trying to tell us something again?" Edward nodded, swallowing a piece of chicken. Maybe. I felt a breeze in the nursery the other day. A little, but enough to move the mobile. I thought it was just my imagination. But he stopped, glancing at Ranger, who was sprawled by the back door, his ears twitching as if he knew they were talking about him. I'll get someone to check. Maybe a home inspector. The next morning Edward called. It was 3 days before their first meeting, which seemed like an eternity since Ranger's growls echoed through the house every night. Eleanor suggested moving Henry's crib to their bedroom in the meantime, but Edward hesitated. What if we miss what he's warning us about? He argued. I'd rather understand it than hide it. So they continued on course, keeping a close eye on Ranger's behavior. That day, working from home in his cramped office nook, Edward noticed something new. Ranger had been calm in the morning, dozing in the sunlight streaming through the nursery window. But as the day wore on, his restlessness grew. By 4 p.m., he would start pacing between the nursery door and the corner, his growling increasing as the sun sank lower. Edward started his notebook, recording times and observations like a detective on a case. He felt the breeze again, stronger late in the afternoon, coinciding with Ranger's agitation. It must be something structural, he muttered to himself, tapping his pen on the page. Could it be a change in temperature? When Eleanor came home from school, she brought more clues. I talked to Mrs. Dawson next door. You know, the one who's lived here forever. She said she noticed water stains on her wall after that big storm last month. The wall that leads to Henry's room. Her eyes widened as she spoke, realizing. What if it's wired? That night, Edward grabbed a flashlight and a ladder, determined to investigate. Ranger watched him carefully from the crib as Edward climbed up to examine the corner. The beam of light showed faint cracks in the paint on the ceiling, cobwebs coming out where the walls met. He pressed his hand against the drywall, cool to the touch, with a subtle vibration he could barely feel. There's something here, he shouted to Eleanor, who was standing in the doorway with her tablet, searching for possible causes. Maybe a hum? Is the air moving? Maybe a pipe, she suggested, scrolling through the article. Or a house mover. Old places like this change all the time. But why is he so much worse at night? That night they were on duty. Around midnight, Edward felt the breeze pick up, accompanied by a faint whistling sound, like the wind slipping through a crack. Ranger's ears pricked up, his growl even but not hostile. As Edward approached the corner with Henry in his arms, Ranger followed him, standing between them and the wall. He's not evil, Edward said quietly, watching the dog's posture. He's protecting us. The inspector arrived 3 days later, a burly man named Tom with a toolbox and a no-nonsense attitude. Dogs are better than half my gear, he said with a smile, nodding to Ranger, who sat intently by the cot. Edward told the story, the Ranger's growl, the breeze, the crackle, while Eleanor bounced on Henry's hip. Tom started with the basics, checking the walls and floor with a level. When he reached the corner, his meter beeped. There's a slight slope here, he said, pressing his hand against the wall. He pulled out a moisture detector, and the reading jumped. High water content. Look at this. He shone the flashlight on the baseboard, revealing a dark, damp streak. Ranger whined, a sharp, insistent sound, not like his usual growl, as Tom tapped on the wall. He knows, Edward said, and a chill ran down his spine. He was trying to tell us. Tom's inspection revealed the terrible truth. Water damage had seeped into the exterior brickwork from a clogged gutter, weakening the structure over months of heavy rain. The vibrations you're feeling? That's water moving through the damaged wood, Tom explained. The heat of the day raises the moisture. At night it cools and sinks. It's subtle, but the dogs hear it loud and clear. He traced the damage to the empty space below, where rot had begun to eat away at the beams. A few more months and this could have collapsed. Your puppy is a hero. The repairs began the following week. The contractors had torn away the rotting wood, revealing a beam so rotten it crumbled to the touch. That should have gone, one of the workers said, shaking his head. Your dog saved you a fortune, or worse. Ranger followed the crew, sniffing their progress, his growls fading as the danger receded. When the nursery was restored, new walls, sealed gutters, a sturdy beam, Ranger's nights were quiet again. He curled up by Henry's crib, his tail wagging softly as he performed his duty as a watchdog. Edward often thought about how close they had come to disaster. The Ranger's instincts had seen what they hadn't, proving that sometimes those who love us most are the first to sound the alarm.